Hey guys, Skyder, thought I would go over this recent survey that Famitsu, a very popular Japanese magazine, took for Elden Ring, and I just wanted to go over the stats for it because I just think this kind of information is funny and it reveals stuff that we do not normally think is true. So I think that would be a pretty interesting idea. So first off, age groups, pretty even spread, I would say. Surprisingly, I am very surprised that there are this many people that are in the older bracket, and I'm surprised that there are not as many people in the younger bracket. I guess everyone here is still like playing Fortnite, and everyone here is like playing like Tetris. But then we got the sweet spot, my age group, which is the best age group, 25 to 39, which seems to be the most. So that's actually, that's about right. I am obviously joking. Playtime between, I mean, yeah, that's about right too. I think most people's first playthroughs takes about 100 to 150 hours. So the fact that this is the highest is not really surprising to me at all. That makes kind of a lot of sense. And then from here, we start going in people that are continuing to play the game after, which is a lot. However, over 300, the absolute neckbeards like us are without a doubt the minority. So turns out people are not playing this game for a living. Wow, that's shocking. But yeah, that's pretty much what I would expect it to be. Levels are going to be probably around that same level too. Now, I think they didn't extend this bracket wide enough because people are usually beating the game at, 150 and above. So if we just go by people who have simply played the game and just beat it once, you're going to have, like the stats say, most people at that 820 or 24 range. So it's kind of weird that they had the cutoffs that low like that, because if you're beating the game, you're going to be probably around that level. So interesting. Most people had most experience with Dark Souls 3, which I think makes the most sense because I think Dark Souls 3 was the most mainstream of all the games, but Bloodborne was right behind it, which is pretty interesting because Bloodborne came out before Dark Souls 3, so there might not have been as big of a player base, but also Bloodborne is amazing, so I guess I kind of understand that too. It's very, very nice. Sekiro had a bit less, which I would agree with, that had less of a staying power than Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3, so Dark Souls Remastered, I can't imagine that's going to be anyone's first Souls game. That doesn't make any sense, really. So those add up. Okay, now let's get into the actual interesting, non-boring data stuff. So players were asked what the most interesting thing about the game was. What's the thing that stuck out to them the most, right? And for most people, it was the story in the world. And I think I can agree with that for the most part. The story is not a conventional story in, like the RPG sense, where you're not a bunch of kids that go eventually kill God at the end. It's not like that type of story. But it is the intrigue and the mystique around the world that is very, very hard to match. For example, I played the game Neo a long time ago, and I didn't give a shit. I stopped playing because I was like, I don't care about this character. I don't like the gameplay is fun. I just don't care about William, I think was his name. He's just so boring. It had no like RPG element, and it didn't have any of the mystique that the Souls games have. So that I understand. Now the field, like being the second right under it, is surprising because the field, I assume, means the open world aspect to it, which has never really mattered that much to Souls players, but it's obviously an incredibly welcome addition. It's been fantastic. So I'm very surprised the field was right below that, but that still kind of makes sense, I guess. Exploration kind of goes with that too. So all these things are basically just the intrigue and mystique of the world combined into one experience that makes you want to just look around and find stuff, which is definitely a feeling you feel with this game. You can easily spend hundreds of hours just looking for stuff, and you'll find stuff too, is the best part. So that is not surprising at all. Boss combat right under there, which is, again, not surprising. That's what these games are known for. They're bosses. I will say some of the bosses in this game are pretty terrible, and some of them are the best we've ever seen. So the sheer volume of bosses means we're going to have more of the bad and more of the good. So there's just no getting around that. You're not going to make you're not going to make 87 Moog fights. You're not going to make 87, Ratigan or Godfrey fights. It's just too hard. It's not a reasonable request. So having some repeat bosses and shitters like Gods Can Duo and things like that are not too surprising. Now, interestingly enough, weapons and armor was pretty close to everything else too, which means the Fashion Souls people almost value how their character looks and what weapons they're using more than the game that they're actually playing, which is pretty funny, honestly, but also very serious because Fashion Souls is probably the most important part of the game. So very well understood. Characters being this important too. See, this I don't agree with. I never really cared about the characters in Souls games past the meme of them being a character you should care about, if you understand what that sentence means. So, like, obviously we go by, I don't know, let's go by Alexander, for example, in this game. people care about Alexander because of the meme of him being a fucking talking pot, and it's ridiculous. But it's like, I personally, like, it's cool, like, their storyline, he wants to, you know, I guess I won't spoil the storyline at the end there, but the it's never really at the forefront of my mind. It's sort of like I'm going through the new area looking for stuff, and I'm like, oh, hey, Alexander's here. What's he doing? Oh, cool. And then I move on. I'm not playing the game to, like, see Alexander's quest come to fruition, you know? So it's never really been at the top of my hierarchy of why these games are so good. But it's, again, it's a welcome side thing to have there. So it's still a cool aspect of the game, but it's never, I'm surprised it's this high on the list, because you can go the entire game without interacting with a single character. Well, not a single character, but 99% of NPCs, and still have an incredible experience. So I'm surprised that was that high. Dungeon crawling, if we include legacy dungeons there, then sure. But I think the repeated dungeons in this game kind of fall under Skyrim syndrome, where they're just, you know, it's actually more of Chalice dungeon syndrome. They're basically just fancier Chalice dungeons, where they're just sort of the same repeated layout with a couple of new rooms in this one. And then you got a stone door with a boss at the end of it. So I didn't find the dungeon crawling that interesting, to be honest. I think that was probably one of the weakest parts of the game, but I like that it was in there for people that do like that stuff. So I'm actually surprised it was that high on the list. Size of the map, it's a weird thing to, like, I just care if the game is good. I don't care how big or small it is. As long as the game is good. But the map is absolutely huge, so I understand that as well. The graphics, I have never given a shit about the graphics of the Souls games. In fact, the graphics of the Souls games are not very good at all. You compare the graphics in Elden Ring to the graphics in, you know, Horizon Zero Dawn, the game that it completely stole the spotlight from. Obviously, Horizon just looks 10 times better. It's just, Elden Ring is not a very technically impressive game in terms of graphics. It's the art design that carries it. And the best part about art design is timeless. It doesn't matter how old the game is, it will always be pretty. Shadow of the Colossus 1 for PlayStation 2 still to this day looks like a gorgeous game, despite being muddy graphics and the bloom is super oversaturated and all that shit. It's still a gorgeous game because the art design is still good, and that will last much longer than a game that tries to look technically impressive, but, you know, it doesn't quite have that art direction there. That's how all Blizzard games last, by the way. Blizzard has zero, like, actual technical, you know, it doesn't look good technically. It's just, you know, World of Warcraft, the art design in that is extremely good. So they're still using these basic textures, but the game has worked because the art design is so good. And so that is what carries Elden Ring. It's the art design, not the actual graphics of it. The Ash of War and weapon arts, I think that kind of ties in with weapons and armor. Yes, I think looking for different types of weapons and stuff like that, and all the Ashes of War, you'll never find all of them and use them in one playthrough. And even when you do find them all, your build won't support all of them, so you have to try different builds. I think that's a lot of replayability there, and that's very good. The music. This may be a controversial take. I didn't think the music in Elden Ring was that good, and that's only because of how good the music is in the previous games. For comparison, I can't remember that many tracks in Elden Ring. There's a couple of incredible standouts. Elden Beast theme, I think, is absolutely beautiful. Regal Ancestor Spirit, also absolutely beautiful. Radagon's theme is just exciting as shit. Godfrey's is good, and Moog's is amazing. And for some reason, Godskin Duos is incredibly good as well. But other than that, there's Placidusax and Lich Dragon Fortisax, and that's pretty much it. Those are the only themes. When I hear them, I can immediately tell you what boss it is. Other than that, it was just a serviceable entry in the OST. I think it was just pretty good. There's no real bad tracks or anything like that, but nothing nearly super memorable like, you know, Bloodborne's entire soundtrack. You play me a sound from Bloodborne, despite me having less hours in that game, I can tell you exactly what boss it is, what time of day it is when you're there, what location it is. I can tell you everything about that. But with Elden Ring, I'm just like, okay, I think that's generic Tree Sentinel boss music 5. I'm not sure. So the OST for Elden Ring, I think, was probably the weakest of the series. Despite still being good, it's only because the standard to which it's held is so high. But there are a couple of standouts that are, yeah, on the level of Bloodborne easily. Spirit Ashes, I think that's a weird thing to like about the game. It's a cool, like, system that helps you with some bosses, but in terms of liking that as an actual main component of the game, that's interesting. The combat balance. Sorcery and incantations. I think we're gonna just include spells in general. That basically falls under weapon arts and stuff too. It's all the same kind of category there, I think. Character design, this is one of the most important parts for me. This is why I didn't like Sekiro, but I did like, you know, every other Souls game, because I like making my character. All of the fun in these games for me is thinking about builds, theory crafting builds, how to optimize stats, and then finally going through and making the build and getting all the items to make my, what I have in my head come to reality. So by far, one of the most important parts for me. Character design would be nearly at the top of this list for me. The horse, good traveling method. I don't know why that's like a main thing, but everything else is just, whatever. Surprisingly, though, multiplayer was actually, it's not surprising at all. Multiplayer had, 1,000 less than, all the things at the top, which says not only do most people not care about PvP, but they don't care about co-op either. Most people are just doing this as a single solo game, which would explain why invasions slow down, even though when there's hundreds of thousands of people playing the game, if only 10% of them are co-oping and you can only invade a couple, like 1 or 2% of them in your level range, suddenly you have a very small player pool to invade because you can't invade solo players anymore, so makes sense. Other than that, that's all pretty much makes sense there. First class chosen, this is a no-brainer. Vagabond has the best just pure physical stats in the game. Vagabond is usually the best choice for most builds that are just going to use basic weapons, even if it's dex, even if it's strength, if it's quality, if it's all that stuff. If you're just using pure physical damage, Vagabond is in fact the best. Samurai is better for dex, so if you're going dex, then Samurai would be better. And then the others were not even remotely close, which is pretty interesting. But it makes sense because these are very optimized. The only other one I would say that is pretty optimized as well is Hero. And Hero is the best for like bleed builds because it has the highest arcane and strength to wield the weapon. So Hero is actually way lower than I thought. But maybe people are not picking based on what their stats could be. They're picking on just what they see. Oh, hey, this Vagabond starts with a halberd and a sword. That's neat. Ooh, the Samurai's got a katana. Awesome. And that's probably all they care about. The fact the Prophet, who has arguably the best starting spell in the entire game and can play the entire game with their starting spell is this low is pretty funny to me. You can legit beat the entire game just with Catch Flame. There's like a couple, like 1 or 2 bosses that you have to kill that are fire resistant. But other than that, you can beat the entire game with Catch Flame alone, which is just funny. Prioritize stats. So I know we all know, well, we want to make the joke that, okay, how is Vigor at the top? Because no one levels Vigor. Well, it's true, no one levels Vigor. It's still the most common stat among every build. No matter what, every build will use some Vigor. So it makes sense that no matter what your build is, you will always use Vigor no matter what. Even if your build has 25 Vigor, that's still putting points into Vigor. So everyone's going to put that, if you aggregate that much data together, it's going to end up being on the top. You can't really avoid that. So for Endurance, I'm surprised that's higher than Strength and Dex. You don't really need very much Endurance in this game. The only time you need Endurance is if you want to wear big, fat, heavy armor like bull goats and stuff like that. But you can get by with literally 9 Endurance. Like, things cost so little stamina in this game that you just don't even need it. The only thing you would need it for is for equip load. So I'm surprised it's that high, to be honest. Dex and Strength, sure. And then everything else sort of makes sense. Faith being the lowest is interesting because Faith has the best buffs in the game. Even with very minor investment, even with like 6 points in Faith on any build, you can get Flame Grant Me Strength, Magic Fortification, Lightning Fortification, all this amazing stuff. So I'm surprised Faith is that low because even though you might not need a lot of it, everyone can just splash into a tiny bit of Faith and get extremely good spells that will help whatever their build actually is. So favorite weapon types, of course, katanas are at the top, which is funny because katanas themselves in this game are not that good. It's funny, like people that are... I guess a little bit more unexperienced with the game, inexperienced, they complain about katanas the most, which is funny because katanas are not that good in this game, especially due to poise and stuff like that. Basically, katana's main good attack is the running R2, and that's pretty much it. The only thing that saves katanas and maybe makes people put it in this category is the Ashes of War on katanas. So it's not that the Moon Veil is good, it's not that Rivers of Blood it's good, it's that Transient Moonlight and Corpse Piler are good. So it's almost like this doesn't even say katanas. This just says Corpse Piler and Transient Moonlight because the actual moveset of the weapon is not that good in my opinion. So it's actually pretty funny that katanas are this high, but everybody in this list is using one of those 2 katanas. You're not using the Meteoric Ore Blade and the Dragonbone Blade and saying, man, this katana's moveset is so good. No, they're using those 2, and that's why they think the katanas are good because it's solely based on the weapon art that they're using, and that's the only attack that they're really using. So if you play like that, that makes sense. Okay, Great Swords being at 641 is super surprising to me because Great Swords, even in PvE, they don't fill a specific niche that are good. They're barely better than Straight Swords in damage, but much slower, and they're just worse than Colossal Swords, but almost the exact same speed since the buff. So it's like, there's barely a difference there. I think greatswords are actually one of the weaker classes in this game. However, there are a couple of greatswords, again, with insane weapon arts, and a lot of people use things like the Blasphemous Blade that do stand out. And if you're only using, Blasphemous Blade's weapon art and not the actual ability, well, then it's actually pretty good. And I think that's what a lot of these things come down to. It's a lot of, okay, I'm not using katanas, I'm using Corpse Piler. I'm not using greatswords, I'm using, Wave of Gold. I'm not using, they're just using the weapon art that makes the weapon pretty decent. So it's not the moveset of the weapon that people actually think are good. It's just the weapon art that they have, which I feel like is almost an entirely separate question at this point. But medium shields being this high too, I was surprised. Even when I invade people or when I was doing invasions for PvE players, I would very rarely see people using medium shields, like ever. It was very rare that I'd see a medium shield. Occasionally you would see like the brass shield, which is a very good early game shield, but I didn't see that many. So the fact that this is this high is actually pretty nuts. Staves being a 411 encompasses everybody that's doing sorcery, so that's going to be a wide category there. Curved swords with the dual curved swords, and there's colossal swords at 385. So now we're getting into things that start to make sense. The one thing that did surprise me on this whole list, though, was bows. Bows being this high, I don't think in an invasion in 800 hours I've seen a single guy using a bow ever. So I'm not sure where they are. They might just be solo players that are just trying to, I don't know. I just don't really ever encounter players using bows ever. So the fact that bows was so high here was actually pretty funny to me. Other than that, though, everything sort of makes sense. I don't know what the hell a Great Claw is. I'm pretty sure that's just a bug. Yeah, it's just not supposed to be there. And fist weapons being at the bottom makes the most sense because fist weapons are just bad. They're just really bad. Fist weapons and claws and daggers have just no range, no poise damage, no stagger potential, no stamina damage on block. They're just bad. The only thing that makes them good is if you infuse bleed on them and just do multiple hits like that. Yeah. So that makes a lot of sense too. So favorite weapon, ashes and skills. Yeah, there it is. So Bloodhound Step overwhelmingly at the top. And it makes sense if we're just surveying the general community about what they find to be powerful. Of course, Bloodhound Step is going to be at the top because it makes you the best dodger in the game. You don't have to learn the timings of any bosses or anything. You just mash L2. Doesn't matter what the boss is doing. You can completely mistime it. You'll be fine because you're invincible basically the entire time. So it's not surprising at all that Bloodhound Step is at the top. This is not even for PvP, by the way. Just for PvE alone, you can basically ignore every timing required by every boss in the game by just mashing L2, which I think is shitty. It's a disservice to the game itself. Obviously, people enjoy using it because it makes them feel powerful, but I think it's just... I'm not going to gatekeep what you want to do in your single-player game. I just think it's a disservice to the game if you just cheese the entire boss by not learning any mechanics, not learning any roll timings. Because that's the whole emphasis, that's the whole point of Souls PvE, is learning the boss's moveset, learning when you can punish the boss, and that's it. Without that, what's left? I don't know, but that's just my opinion. Transient Moonlight being the second one is very not surprising at all. Moonveil is one of the best weapons in the game for just simply completing the game. The amount of stagger on the L2, R2 is ridiculous. Even on bosses, you can stagger Radagon on like 3 hits, which is just stupid. So I very much understand why people would use the Moonveil for their main playthroughs. Parry being the right under these two is pretty funny though. But it makes sense. Parry is such a universal tool. It used to be a base mechanic, but now you need a specific thing for it. So it makes sense that a specialized tool that used to be a base mechanic is going to be rated quite high. I should say Corpse Piler, not Rivers of Blood, but obviously you understand what they mean. Rivers of Blood being there also makes sense. Now, Hoarfrost Stomp makes me think that this was taken a while ago when Hoarfrost Stomp was a lot better, but then Rivers of Blood wouldn't be this high because Rivers of Blood was buffed and Hoarfrost Stomp was nerfed. I'm not sure. Was there a patch in between them? Was that between like 1.02 and 1.04? I'm not sure. If there was a patch in between them, then that would make sense. But other than that, that's actually very confusing. Flame of the Red Mains makes sense for PvE because it does insane stagger damage. Same thing sort of like Transient Moonlight. In 3 uses of it, you'll stagger most bosses for a riposte. So that makes a lot of sense. Bloody Slash being that high is kind of interesting. And then from there, we just go on to some more basic stuff. For favorite sorceries and incantations, Comet Azure makes sense. Everyone's seen the videos where you drink the infinite FP, you stand in Terra Magica, you stack damage, walk into a boss fog, and bzzz, and you just skip the boss. That doesn't work on every boss. A lot of bosses will dodge out of the way, and then it's not going to do anything. But there's a lot of bosses you can entirely skip, like Godfrey, Commander Niall, like all those bosses that will edgy walk to you. Yeah, you can pretty much just entirely skip with Comet Azure, so it makes sense. Golden Vow being second place was surprising to me, because it's a bit more out of the way in Mount Gelmir, so not everyone's going to immediately have it. It requires a Faith build, which seems to be the least played type of build based on the stats above, so that's kind of interesting. Duel's Moonblade, this has to be before the nerf. Yeah, I think this survey was taken before that nerf, because the Duel's Moonblade destroys everything before the nerf. Now it doesn't do very good damage, but that makes sense. Rock Sling is the best PvE spell, I think, to spam for a sorcerer, because it does physical damage, so they're not really going to resist it, and also it staggers like nothing. You can use like 3 or 4 rock slings on a dragon's head and it'll just stagger them, and you can cast it very fast. It's got insane tracking, it's got good range. Useless in PvP because players can just dodge that shit, but in PvE, yeah, I completely understand that. Flame Cleanse Me being this high, I guess it makes sense. Basically everybody that's gone to the Lake of Rot will use this spell, so that makes sense. Glintstone Pebble also makes sense. It's one of the most cost-efficient damage spells in the entire game, so perfectly makes sense there. And then, yeah, everything else sort of makes sense from here. Favorite Talismans. It's funny that the Erdtree's favor is so high because the Erdtree's favor is not even that good. It's been nerfed and nerfed and nerfed in every game to the point where it's giving you just like a couple of % of health and a couple of % of equip load, and stamina is barely important. So I'm surprised that the Erdtree's favor is so high because it's just not even that good. Shard of Alexander, though, absolutely one of the best talismans in the game. It is, yeah, extremely good. So much so that it's banned in tournaments. It just lets you do too much damage with weapon arts that already do too much damage. So, yeah, absolutely makes sense being there. Great Jar's Arsenal, again, is a no-brainer on basically every build because every build wants armor and every build wants to have some poise and things like that. So, Great Jar's Arsenal can be used on pretty much every build in the game except if you're doing a Blue Dancer naked guy. That's pretty much it. Gold Scarab, you know what's happening here. Put it on, go farm Elenurix. That makes perfect sense. Dragon Crest, great shield talisman for PvE, is extremely good. It's like, what, 15% damage reduction, 20%, something like that? Very, very good. Graven Mass, also extremely good for sorcery. And then we go on there. I'm surprised that Lord of Blood Exaltation is this low. Seems like a lot less people are doing bleed builds than you'd think. Favorite Spirit Ashes, don't even have to look at the list. I know Mimic Tears at the top, by far the best. I never used Black Knife Tish. I've heard very good things about her, but I've never actually used her because I've never fought the boss that you get it from, and I've heard that boss is a nightmare. So, interestingly enough, after my first playthrough, I just stopped using these entirely. But I do want to see Black Knife in action because I've heard she is extremely strong. Latenna is the archer that shoots, like, if you put her in a corner, she'll just sit there and just shit arrows at the boss for the entire time. And Spirit Jellyfish is in third place because it's the first one you get. That's actually pretty funny. NPCs that love the strongest impressions. Yeah, obviously it's gonna be Ronnie. Everyone sims for Ronnie, including me. I love Ronnie. Her voice is just awesome. Alexander being the second is not surprising. You know who I'm surprised is not here is Bach. Bach is not even on the list. I'm guessing because people just never even found Bach, but Bach is one of the most endearing characters in the game. Blythe being super high makes sense. Millicent also is very cool. Melina being below all of them is kind of an oof for her. And then we got Patches. You know what? I think Selin, I would put Selin like right above Alexander. Selin is like one of the one characters in the game that actually just like wholeheartedly believes in you. Selin is just such a nice lady, despite being obviously dabbling in the primeval current and, you know, fucking things up. She's so nice to you though. Like, not even like in like a she's tricking you nice sort of way. She just genuinely cares for you. And like, she thinks even if you're stupid, she'll like, you know, she has that line where she's like, you know, even if, you know, you don't become Elden Lord, you still have a place at my side. It's okay. Like, she's like, it's just a supportive mom. I love her. And then she turns into a ball. So, I think Selin was one of my favorite NPCs in the entire game. Raya being so low is pretty impressive too, because her snack form is just adorable. Enemies left the strongest impression. This is not necessarily the enemies that are the strongest in the game, but they left the strongest impression. I agree, Radahn should be at the top of this list. I think Radahn is the coolest impression, because there's nothing else like Radahn's fight in the game. You spawn into the beach, he's just at the end of the beach, he just immediately starts shooting arrows at you, and then you start summoning all your bros that you've seen as NPCs like throughout the game, and they all just charge at this field. It's the most epic shit in the game, I think. I fully agree with this Radahn being the most impactful boss, because there's nothing else like it. It's a giant war. Instead of just having a 1v1 with a boss, it's a war that you have. And that is incredible. And I will never forget my first experience with Radahn. That was just awesome. Melania being second, because the sheer amount of times you see her cutscene, or see a amount of times that you just get destroyed by her, makes perfect sense. Margit being your first real main boss, I think puts him at the third, and that's perfectly fine. And honestly, I like Tree Sentinel being at 4, despite the fact it's just a generic enemy later. I like the fact that it's the number 4 because it's typically the first optional boss you can encounter. You just roll out of the start and she's just sitting right there. And of course, all of us, diehard Souls idiots, instead of actually leveling up to the appropriate strength to killing him, we just bashed our head against it for an hour until we killed it. But yeah, I can understand that. Everything else here sort of makes sense. Yeah, everything else is good. Areas that left the strongest impressions. Caelid being the highest. Dude, I don't understand. I think Caelid is overhyped. I think Caelid is completely overhyped. I will say, I remember my first playthrough when I approached the border from Limgrave to Caelid. I remember thinking, oh, that doesn't look good. It's just red scarlet rot everywhere. I was like, oh, that place is going to suck. But then after going there, Caelid's my favorite place in the game now to go at the start of the game. Because it doesn't matter what class you are. You're a spellcaster, the meteorite staff's there, Rocksling is there. If you're Dex or Strength or whatever, Radigan's Sword Seal is there. Like the Star Scourge Heirloom is there. There's so many good items you can get for free without having to do anything. You just walk there. So I go to Caelid basically at the start of the game every time now. So I love Caelid, but Caelid was interesting. It didn't strike me as that scary to me. Like, it was just, I don't know, the bird dogs are creepy and stuff. But the most impactful thing that I had in the game was taking the lift down into Siofa River, which I guess you would sort of include in Nokron or Nokron. Yeah, by far that was the most impactful point of the game for me. I'm surprised that Siofa River is 13 on this list. How is that not the most epic sight in the entire game? You just go down a random well and you go down for 16 days, and then you're in like this completely alien world with like stars in the sky despite being underground. It's unmatched. That is by far my favorite experience in the entire game, was going down that well. So the fact that Siofa River was so far down there was very surprising. Although Nokron is very high up, so it might have been including the same area, because maybe people refer to that as Nokron because it's just the area right before it. So I can, maybe people were confusing those things together. Who the fuck puts, oh wait, no, it's strongest impressions. Okay, never mind. Not their favorite zones, it's just strongest impressions. Okay, like a rot makes sense there. Favorite online features. It's funny. I originally looked at this and was like, wow, people really don't like PvP. But if you actually compare it, favorite online features, we have cooperative multiplayer, which is 746 people. Intrusion multiplayer and hostile multiplayer, which I'm assuming means duels and invasions. Individually, the numbers are kind of low, but if we add these together, 293 plus 169, we're at 462. So, it's not as small of a population compared to co-op as I think it would be. It's basically 500 versus 750, which is not that big of a difference. So I think there's actually more people interested in PvP than I actually thought, because I thought it was like 1% of the player base. But if you combine these two together, that's a decent portion of people that chose that as their favorite online feature. Not even a feature they dabble into, it's their favorite feature. So that was surprisingly more than I thought. Other than that, though, that's pretty much it. I just thought it'd be interesting to go over this stuff and kind of like a recap of my first experience in the game and how I compare to these stats. So just thought it'd be interesting to go over. That's about it. Thanks for watching, guys.